Good morning, everyone. I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APAICS, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. I hope everyone's enjoying the breakfast. If not, please take a moment to get some coffee and wake up your day. Welcome to day 2 of the Legislative Leadership Summit. For those who joined us yesterday, I hope you found the panels and plenaries insightful. We're thrilled to host you today as we have conversations around a variety of topics affecting the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Amazon, for their support, as well as partners Horizon Therapeutics, Meta, and State Farm. Please feel free to use the QR code to get the updated version of the schedule and the bios of the speakers and panelists. And feel free to share your thoughts by tagging APAICS on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram with hashtag APAICSLeads. Next, I'd like to introduce our speaker. And actually, before that, I really want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the plenary for today. And as we head into midterm elections, the next panel is a timely discussion on voting rights and access to the ballot. We know from previous studies that when we have more Asian Americans running for office, the more enthusiastic our community is about voting. So we'll hear from subject matter experts on how our community is working to make voting rights, make voting accessible, and make it a part of our community's civic engagement. And so next, I'd like to introduce our speaker from Meta, Soraya Tapia Hadley. She serves as manager of the public policy, and she is previously a principal at the Rabin Group, where she advised U.S. and international clients in the nonprofit and private sector on how to navigate Washington, D.C. Previously, she was also vice president of government affairs for UPS. So let's please give her a warm welcome.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. How's everyone? Great. It's such an honor to be here with you all in person. I know everyone is very excited yesterday to be back together and looking forward to today and tonight, this evening's gala. On behalf of Meta, I'd like to congratulate APAICS for its legacy of developing leaders in the public policy space. I actually have the pleasure of working with a number of them at Meta. And congratulations on such a successful policy conference. Thank you again for having us. As Madeline mentioned, I'm Soraya Tapia, manager for public policy and external affairs. I have the pleasure of leading a range of our national organizational partnerships, APAICS among them. And so we're very aware these last 2 years have been disproportionately tough for the Asian and Pacific Islander communities. We've heard about the very real threats and challenges being faced and how representation in all areas and at all levels is key to changing things. It was so eloquently put, I think, yesterday by one of your speakers, and when she said that the community just doesn't want to continue to be invisible. And as a social network, we understand and we value the importance of sharing our stories, making connections, and together celebrating the wins, but also sharing together in the challenges. To that end, I'd like to share with you today that Meta just announced the launch of a program called Meta Prosper. It's a multifaceted program to partner with and support API communities through, one, the creation of more programming and content featuring API-owned businesses and leaders, along with the promotion of their social media channels, building also culturally relevant content, arts programming, and business education programs for entrepreneurs. And by making it a priority to provide API-owned small businesses access to the Meta Fast Track invoicing program, which is basically a bridge and can serve communities to be that bridge of liquidity that businesses rely on to stay afloat when they have outstanding payments from their vendors. We know this program is only the beginning, and we're energized at the chance to getting to work with you and share these stories and resources with your communities. And we're humbled at the opportunity to get to work with you all and this great organization, APAICS. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you this morning. Look forward to the panel and to learning more from you. Thanks again, and thank you for your partnership, Madeline, and the team at APAICS. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. How we doing? I see that we have the true believers up early in the morning to hang out, which we appreciate. Normally I would ask everybody to move up closer so we could actually have a nice little conversation, but we're in the middle of a pandemic still, so I guess you get away with it this one time. But next time, I'm going to make you all move up so we can see you all, we can have a real conversation. But it's good to be with you. Again, my name is Gregg Orton. I'm the National Director of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. We're the big umbrella coalition of 38 of the largest Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander civil rights organizations in the country. As a friend described us, we're sometimes known as the Avengers of the community because everybody brings a unique strength to the table, and then we spend a lot of time disagreeing and arguing. But then at the end of the day, we rise to the occasion and come together and provide a unified voice for our community. And that's really the point of the work we do up here in DC. And so we're very proud of all of our members and the work that they do. But again, pleasure to be with you. We're here today to talk about voting rights. And I will say before we get started, you can tell how far we are in May in Heritage Month based on the energy and the greetings that Christine and I give each other, because in the beginning of the month, it's excitement. We're excited to see each other. We're like, let's do this, let's go. And it's May 24th now. And we're going to be super excited and engaged in this conversation. But if you saw us this morning, it's like, oh, hey, Christine. Hey, Gregg. How's it going? It's okay. You okay? I'm okay. So we know, it's been a long month, but it's been exciting. And there's been lots of awesome programming all over the city, certainly here at APAICS. And so, again, glad you're here and let's get into it. But it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. And we'll do this a little bit differently because there's only 3 of them and there's a few of you. So we'll make this a little bit more laid back and relaxed and start the day off right. But I'll ask all of our panelists to introduce themselves, and with the starting question today, 2022, what are you doing as it relates to voting rights and the API civic engagement space? So Christine, if you want to start.
What am I not doing that's related to the elections? I've been doing that since 2019. So for APIAVote, we work with local partners in over 28 states to mobilize them for the midterm elections and every single election. So we're doing everything from actually going out to the field right now, even though we're emerging out of the pandemic, but we're doing a number of trainings already in person as well as virtual. But, just getting everyone excited and rethinking about the importance of the elections coming out. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Christine. Niyati?
Hi, so Christine doesn't need an introduction, but let me introduce myself. I'm Niyati Shah. I'm the Director of Litigation at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Christine, you do not need an introduction. Everybody knows Christine Chen. But at AAJC, we are looking at voting and civic engagement through education, through litigation. We're litigating, for example, in Georgia with the SB 202. And, in those respects where we're trying to make sure that our communities do get to vote because there's so many restrictions on their ability to cast a ballot. We're trying to do education about how you can access the ballot. We've done things around redistricting and trainings around that. And also remembering that, these education materials and outreach efforts need to also be in language and making sure we're protecting language access when it comes to voting, both under the Voting Rights Act in terms of 208, which allows you to have assistance, and in terms of 203, which requires that election-related materials, which is a very broad term, are translated in the covered languages, and new determinations came out this year. So it's very important, and they always just say Asian language, and what does that really mean? Because, that's a whole other kettle of fish. So that's a little bit about what we're doing at AAJC, and I'll toss back to you.
Great, thanks. I will say our next speaker, the esteemed Jerry Vattamala, we get to hang out like once a year. I literally see him once a year, and so I was like, "Hey man, what's up? It's good to see you." But it's always once a year, and it's always funny because it's like he never left, or I guess maybe when I see him in New York. But he walked in today, and we're all running a little behind because traffic was there. And I'm serious. I was like, "Oh, it's Jerry. That's good. Everything is right because we're back on a panel together. We're talking about stuff, and we're doing the work." So Jerry, go ahead.
Very good. Thanks for calling me out for being late.
We're all late. Don't worry.
My name is Jerry Vattamala. I'm the director of the Democracy Program at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, AALDEF. We are headquartered in New York. We were founded in 1974. We use a lot of different tools to advocate for our community. We litigate. We do public education. We organize the community. So right now, there's so much going on. Many of you know about redistricting. We're involved in several states. In New York, we just got some great lines for congressional and state senate, which we had to really fight for. It's a real mess there, if anyone was following that. In Texas, we have 3 lawsuits. We have a redistricting lawsuit challenging lines that divided our community, which again, like in many states, we were the fastest growing racial group, and they tried to turn the census numbers on their head and divide our community. We are also challenging SB 1 in Texas, the voter suppression law, and as Niyati was mentioning about Section 208, that provision that allows someone to be assisted by a person of their choice. They're attacking that in Texas. We had to litigate years ago on that very issue and won a case. That's one of the 3 lawsuits. We're trying to enforce that permanent injunction that we won there. In Section 203, as Niyati mentioned also, all these newly covered jurisdictions, Philadelphia is newly covered for Chinese. We were just there last week monitoring the primary elections to make sure that they were actually complying, and guess what? They're not, right? And we're going to see how we're going to get them to comply, whether it's litigation or advocacy. Today, we are in Texas, in Harris County for the runoff elections. With our Asian American exit poll and poll monitoring program. Some of you may know that. We do that every major election. We started in 1988. That's how we identify so many of these problems that our communities face, whether it be Section 203 or 208 or just good old-fashioned discrimination and racism that we see at the polls. We're able to identify that through the exit poll and poll monitoring program that's in 14 states and Washington, D.C., real-time voter protection from volunteers from the community. So those are some of the things that we're working on. And again, redistricting is still ongoing in a few different places, and litigation is still ongoing.
Thanks, Jerry. And we will get back to the redistricting stuff in New York because it is crazy and everyone should be aware of it. And the story of how it all came together is rather remarkable. So we'll come back to it. But Christine, right, we've been talking about, and everyone's heard the news stories, right, about how restrictive voting right laws have become all over the country. We've seen it. We're doing our best to figure out a way to combat it, address it. Tell us more about, from your perspective, what this all looks like and the impact it's having.
Right. So for those of you who haven't been keeping up in the news, even from the beginning of this year, there's been at least 19 states that's passed 34 laws restricting access to voting. And so that's only just within the last few months, right? And we know that based on 2020 as well as 2021, that Asian American Pacific Islander voters, actually almost 3 out of 4 voters voted early or by mail. So now when we're actually heading to the midterm elections where there are certain states, quite a good number of them, especially in southern states and battleground states, where they're restricting their ability to go ahead and vote early and in person. To vote early in person and by mail. And so as a result of that, we know that we have to then re-educate our community when their preference is to actually go ahead and to vote by mail and vote early, because many of them are coming from limited English proficient communities where it's ideal to be able to sit around with your family and friends, go through the ballot, take your time, and then you'll submit it at ease. And so we really need to go ahead and retrain and rethink everyone's plans in terms of how they're going to go out and vote. We know that when you make a plan to vote, you're more likely to actually turn out. And we saw that in 2020 because the numbers exceeded all of our expectations. We actually increased our voter participation and voter registration larger than any other community across the board.
So many of us are not lawyers, right? And so we understand whenever Christine talks about this stuff about engaging our communities and getting out there and educating them about what's going on and getting them updated on sort of the landscape of voting, it makes sense to us. But we're lucky enough to have 2 legal minds on this panel. And I've always, wondered about this, but how is the work different? I mean, you all see it from a slightly different perspective. It certainly feels like things are getting worse. The work you have, the list of things you have to do, it's probably getting longer and longer by the month, which I'm sure you don't enjoy. But help us understand, for those of us who aren't lawyers, kind of what the work looks like.
I mean, it starts with the work that Christine talked about with organizations that are on the ground who are going into our communities and helping them come up with a plan, figuring out how to apply for the absentee by mail ballots, or, how to get language assistance, or providing the language assistance. And they're the ones that tell us where the problems are, where the obstacles are. And they're the ones that usually fix them, as Jerry's talked about. Advocacy comes through them and the work that they're doing. When those efforts fall short, because with even as Herculean as they are, they're not always enough. And that's a little bit where we come in. So for example, in Georgia, and again, keeping in mind, these restrictions are all hitting at the margins. Elections in purple states like Georgia, which is purple, which is exciting, and blue, last one, or Arizona or Nevada, or you want to take any of these states, you don't have to disenfranchise a whole bunch of people. You just need to disenfranchise just a little bit, right? And that's enough to do that, right? Like in Georgia, it was President Trump was like, I just need 11,000 votes. And when we're the fastest, even though we're the fastest growing community, those are our numbers. We're 4% in Georgia. That's all they need to cut, right? If we can restrict a little bit here and a little bit there, we win. And so what do they do when we like voting by mail? They made it applying for the ballot really hard. You can only apply online on the Secretary of State's website in Georgia. It's only in English. It's hard to navigate. The rejection rates for the applications in the Asian American community were really high. They were the highest. If you don't have the ballot, you can't vote online. So that's where litigation, which is often a blunt instrument, we come in and we try to just stop it from at all going into effect, rather than saying, how do we constructively help you navigate it, which is what the groups on the ground do. So that's a little bit of what we can do with litigation. But frankly, it works in tandem. And it's important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily something that you have to say that at this point now, it used to be, but at this point now, you just have to cut at the margins, and that's usually enough.
Yeah, it was 11,780. It's like seared into my brain, that exact number that the former guy needed in Georgia. But, it is a mix of different things that we do. We don't just litigate. I mean, there's a lot of advocacy. Right now, we're trying to pass in New York State the New York Voting Rights Act. And I would hope more states now can pass their own state voting rights act to close the gap. There's litigation is one tool that we do use that usually is our last resort. It is the most, I would, in my view, resource intensive thing to do. We sued the city of Hamtramck. Anyone know where Hamtramck is? It's in Michigan, outside Detroit. Very big Bangladeshi community, big Yemeni population. In the early 2000s, DOJ actually sued them. That city had forced those members of the community only to take a loyalty oath to the U.S. before they could actually vote. And that's a traditionally Polish city. For the last 100 years, they had only Polish mayors, and there's a lot of backlash against this new emerging community. They were covered under Section 203 that required them to translate all their voting materials into Bengali. And we worked with the community through our exit poll and poll monitoring, and tried through advocacy to get them to comply. And when they would not, and they refused, we ultimately had to sue them. We sued them, and within 1 month, we had a consent decree, which required them to provide all the translations, have interpreters, actually provide the language assistance that was required. And guess what? The very next election, you had the first Muslim American mayor of the city, because the people were actually able to vote. I mean, that's the really gratifying part of our job too, is when you see instant results right away through whatever it is, advocacy or litigation. That's our goal here, is to empower our community.
Thanks, Jerry. Anytime we're citing numbers specifically that have been seared into our minds, I think it's a good reminder that we also have to take time to take care of ourselves. So hopefully you get a chance to do that, because I know there are numbers seared into my mind that whenever they pop in, I'm like, oh, this is not good. This is not good. But thank you for all the work, and certainly the victories that we're hearing about are important, because these are the stories that oftentimes don't get the kind of attention at the national level that they deserve, because it shows that when we work towards these ends, we can actually win. So Jerry, thank you for that work. Back to you, Christine. Everybody understands sort of what's happening around us and intuitively the impact that it's having for a lot of underserved communities. But help us understand from an Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community perspective, rather, what are the impacts of all these laws, and how is it impacting behaviors and attitudes and views of our electoral system?
Yeah, I actually also want to step back a little bit just to give everyone context in terms of what the community has been facing, and also our community-based organizations who are really the trusted messengers on the ground who are doing this work. Because, we need to hear from them for us to be able to provide it over to our legal experts to make sure that there's a case and that we're able to go ahead and chase after and making sure that these laws are changed, or that we actually have to make sure that these experiences don't happen again, right? So in 2019, to level set, we were actually heading into the 2020 elections, but it's actually once every 20 years that you actually have the census happening at the same time as a presidential election. So we knew going into 2020 that we had to get as many nonprofit organizations focusing on doing this work and we actually ended up doing over 50 in-person trainings across the country to get them ready for those two things, right? So the whole idea is that January 2020 hits, we have the volunteers and we're just going to go in implementation mode, right? So we started out with the presidential primaries, and then COVID hits, right? The pandemic hits. So a lot of those same organizations were the same ones that had to go ahead and pivot to do a lot of wellness checks with our community to educate them about what was actually happening. Because at the same time, this pandemic, it was happening so quickly that a lot of the government agencies were not necessarily translating all the materials properly to make sure that we were able to educate our community who are limited English proficient. At the same time, we also know that anti-Asian violence was starting to increase. But because of all this, I would say that the local nonprofits are the ones that were able to continue to talk to them, to actually have that relationship. So every step of the way during 2020, there was actually regular contact, probably more contact than we've ever seen in any other presidential election. But during this entire time period, our folks were really smart about making sure that they also talked about the census while they're assisting folks and feeding people and giving them the assistance. And then ultimately, at the end of the year, making sure that they understood everything that they're experiencing is also tied to what elected officials and candidates, what decisions that they're making, and how that impacts their own lives. So I think because of that whole context, the multiple touches, the multiple engagement from our trusted messengers, that we're able to see that large turnout, right? And with that, heading into 2021, we also saw a large increase in early voting. So I'm really actually hopeful for 2022 for the midterm elections, but with the caveat that we actually all have to do a lot of work, just as much as we did in 2020 or even more, just because of these new laws that are being implemented. The whole idea that everyone right now, I would say that a lot of them really are believing that they could just go ahead and vote early or by mail without any particular reason. And all those type of things have actually changed. We also even have to educate our own local nonprofits that the laws have changed and what that actually means in terms of how they actually need to go ahead and talk about making their plan to vote. At the same time, we've also gone through redistricting. So many times you may not realize that who was a candidate on your ballot in the past no longer represents you, or that there are new people who are on the ballot. So we have to take the time to re-educate the community in terms of who is on the ballot and who these actually candidates are.
So for other two panelists, we have a good sense of who's at risk with the passage of these laws. But from your perspective, with all the work that you're doing, what does it really look like on the ground? I mean, oftentimes, let's be honest, the lawsuits that you're fighting for and winning, people aren't even aware of. Sometimes it's the first time I hear about some of this work, but we know the impact of the work and who actually benefits from it are populations that are oftentimes unseen. So what does that look like for you? And then also, to Christine's point, beyond just educating our community and getting ready for each election cycle, what can be done about these laws? I mean, the answer may not be as straightforward as we hope, but there has to be some things that we can do.
I mean, vote. But I think it's important to remember that it's a good thing that you're not hearing about the lawsuits that Jerry and I are doing, because you're just able to go out and vote and it's seamless. And it's important to remember that our elections can be safe and secure, and not to buy into the myths that the other side is trying to propagate. Because it's like they're inventing a problem. First, it used to be voter fraud. When that got debunked, now there's like election integrity. I want to be able to believe in it. Well, you're the ones that are causing the lack of faith in your communities about the security of this election. And then you're saying that that's the problem that we need to fix with these restrictive voting laws. It's incredible. It's genius, right? But having said that, I think it is important to stay vigilant in your communities to see what the state and local legislatures are doing. For example, in Arizona, they just passed a bill that's going to require proof of citizenship. It's going to impact mostly naturalized citizens on your voter registration. You have to put your place of birth now, not your date of birth, the place of birth. Why would you do that? What effect is that going to have, right? And so who is that really going to impact? Simultaneously, though, we have to also protect the victories that we have achieved. So, we're all for modernizing elections and voting and voter registration systems. So things like automatic voter registration can be really great if they're done correctly and don't have collateral damage. One place that it was done really well was in Illinois, where local stakeholders all came together in coalition to pass a streamlined way of registering to vote, which is the first barrier to voting. You can't vote unless you're registered to vote. To do that in a way that protected immigrants and non-citizens, or, that if you're not there, then if you're not a citizen, you don't get automatically registered to vote. You're not offered it. You're not given this, because there's countless examples of people saying, are you a U.S. citizen? No. Do you want to register to vote? Yes, because I want to vote and I'm not a citizen. I don't know. Right. And it's not in language half the time. So these stakeholders came together to protect our green card holders and our non-citizens, to say, yes, we want to make registering to vote easier, but we don't want it to come on the backs of these citizens, or our non-citizen community members. And they did a comprehensive bill. It got passed. It was great. And it wasn't getting enforced. So we did use litigation as a tool to get that law enforced in a safe manner, which now means that you get in-language voter registration in Illinois, because there's, again, a 203 covered jurisdiction in Cook County for Asian language and Spanish, multiple Asian languages, I should say. So that means you get to go to the DMV and you get voter registration in language, which is amazing. And we have to, as Terry said, celebrate the victories that we can get. And it's good that we don't hear about them, because it means you get to go in and seamlessly engage in our democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I would, what does it look like on the ground? Depends where you are. In Texas, people are scared because there's criminal liability. You could go to jail under SB 1. That's why one of the reasons why we're challenging it. You have to fill out this long, confusing oath. And if you do anything more, one word more than strictly translate what's on the ballot, you could go to jail, right? So when you go to help somebody vote and they say, well, what do I do with my ballot now? Oh, you put it over there? Well, you're saying something more than what's on the ballot. And provisions like that, where you are attacking that aspect of voting, of somebody assisting a voter that can't read the ballot, doesn't understand English, that's really targeting our community, because we do have such a large limited English proficient population, and it's relentless. I mentioned earlier we had to challenge another provision that Texas had that said you had to be a registered voter in the county in which you were providing your translation service. right? So many people in our community, you've probably seen them sometimes, they will bring their minor child or grandchild to assist them. And they can't be a registered voter, right? They're minors. And for that very reason, we actually brought a case with a South Asian woman who was prevented from being assisted by her son. He was actually a college student, but he was registered in the neighboring county. And we had to sue in district court. They appealed. We went to the Fifth Circuit and won, and got attorney's fees. So thank you, Texas taxpayers. But we had to fight tooth and nail on something that was very clearly a violation of federal law. And here we are. So we had a permanent injunction in that case, and that was 2018. And then just this summer, 2021, they passed SB 1, which basically was trying to attack Section 208 again. So it is a relentless effort. I think our community, we are somewhat scared. Christine mentioned that the Asian hate in so many states all over the country. So many people would prefer not to go out to a hostile environment, like a poll site. A lot of times it is hostile. So we want to vote by mail or vote early. And in Texas, for the primary election that just happened a few months ago, so many people in our community tried to vote by mail, but because of this new provision in SB 1, we had thousands of mail ballots that were rejected the day before Election Day. So these are people, a lot of them were immobile, immunocompromised, did not want to go in person. They found out the day before Election Day that their mail-in ballot was rejected. So, I mean, there's a lot of fear and frustration in the community, and that's why we're challenging some of these laws. I do want to say we are also sometimes going a little bit trying to expand who can vote. So we don't want to be all doom and gloom. In New York City, they actually passed a city law that allows non-citizens that have legal status to vote in municipal elections. And there are over 1 million non-citizens with legal status in New York City, which are completely going to change the calculus for elections, especially empower the Latino and the Asian communities there. But of course, now that's being challenged by conservative voters, and we're active. We intervened in that lawsuit. So there's efforts to expand, passing State Voting Rights Act and doing things like expanding who can vote. But most of our work, unfortunately, is protecting against bad things. And in some of the worst cases, it's criminal liability. You could actually go to jail. And there's a lot of ambiguity in a lot of these laws, so people don't know even what is prohibited. So there is a lot of fear, and we try and educate, but we also try and litigate and stop these things from happening so our community could go to the polls without this fear hanging over their head.
So I also want to inject that, we were talking a lot about limited English proficient voters, but we also can't forget like 18 to 29-year-olds, where that's the largest growth that we're seeing in the API electorate. But they're also, especially for students, their ballots and mail-in ballots are actually being rejected, especially those who are voting by absentee. They may be going to college at a different location than where they grew up at. And so they want to vote in their home state, but their ballots are being rejected in that way. But there are things that all of us can do. I think it also goes back to the fact that each of us, if we're able to take the day off, or even actually to volunteer, even leading up to the elections, to work at the polling locations, right? Or for some folks, since we're here at APAICS, I want to go ahead and note that B. Wynn from Georgia, as well as Josh Ng Price from Arkansas are running for Secretary of State. So they're there, challenging, and want to make sure that they're in the leadership to be able to make sure that the elections are actually implemented fairly. And so there's different ways that we can all get involved, whether as a volunteer or for those that are running for office.
I think Christine raises a really good point on this one, because I don't know if you guys have seen the stories, but election workers who were intimidated are quitting, right? Their lives were threatened. And who's taking their places? It's a scary thought. And so if you have the ability to be a volunteer, to get a job as an election worker or poll worker, it's really important to have, and it's important when you go to the polls, if you go into the polls, to see somebody that looks like you. It feels comforting and who won't judge you if your English isn't perfect. And it won't be so intimidating. So if we can say that that's something that y'all can do or encourage your family members to do, please do it.
And if I could just lift up the people that have come forward to be named plaintiffs, it's not an easy thing to do. I can't bring a case as AALDEF. We need clients, plaintiffs, and sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we have a really strong case, but nobody's willing to come forward, and I can't blame them. To have standing, most of our clients, they will need to be a citizen. They're usually newly naturalized. They're limited English proficient. And it's going to, so and so versus the state of Texas, right? And it has to be some convincing that goes on. But I really want to lift up those organizations, because even organizations, they have board meetings that has to be approved. A lot of organizations say we don't want to get involved in that. And in a place like Texas, when you do come forward, they really make sure to depose you and, no other word to say it, harass you and make you pay for agreeing to be a named plaintiff. But still, we have people that are coming forward. So I want to thank everybody in the community and lift them up that had the courage to come forward and help us all out.
I think that's spot on. We're going to shift gears. Everybody buckle up. We're going to talk about the exciting topic of redistricting. Yeah, that's right. The reason why is, again, I think a lot of us have a pretty good understanding, baseline recognition of sort of the work of civic engagement, but redistricting is oftentimes overlooked, and it's a key component of this sort of the process and also the opportunities for organizations like the ones represented on stage to do some really good work. So Christine, I know for a fact you're traveling all over the country. You're working with lots of different groups. What does the redistricting work look like?
It goes back to, what's been really exciting is that, since we were doing, a lot of our groups were focusing on getting out the count for a census. Back in 2020, we were already talking about redistricting. So I've been in this field for almost 3 decades now. And I would say this cycle, I've actually seen a lot more states, a lot more community-based organizations and individuals getting involved with redistricting. So that's really exciting. And with that, the role that APIAVote plays has been really about just going to individual community members, educating them about what is redistricting and what is their role. A lot of times it's a matter of just even participating in a mapping exercise where we're re-identifying where the growth of the community is, or where the local Asian supermarket is, or where the apartment complex where there's a large API population, because a lot of things have changed in the last 10 years. But that is data and information that those who are drawing maps and those to the right of me are able to utilize that when they're in coalition to actually redraw the maps. The other role that we've been really emphasizing and preparing our community members for was really about testimony, about why, what does that neighborhood look like in their own area, and what does that actually mean to their livelihood. So these stories are once again information that the lawyers are able to take a look at and utilize. And sometimes there's also just a legal strategy in terms of hearing those testimonies and how that actually could be utilized.
Yes, I think that it's interesting. We went from GOTC to GOTV to GOTR, but it's all about, communities of interest, right? Who and how do we define those? And there are many ways. Race could be one. It's the big one, but it's language. It's, job or socioeconomics. It's schools. It can be a whole host of things of how you from the community define your community of interest and where the boundaries are. And, especially in the AAPI communities, we are emerging communities. And there are, I would say, at least 3 levels of redistricting that we have to keep in mind. There's the federal redistricting, there's the state redistricting, and then there's the local. And in the local is where the fun is. People don't think it is, but it is. And it's where your communities will really feel an impact. Like in Illinois, in Chicago, in Chinatown, they now have an Asian district, but That required participation of the community. And it requires them in the past to want to update their library. They had a one-story library. There wasn't enough room. People were sitting on the floors. They never got a district, and until they got a minority district where they had enough power to change the outcome, they didn't get a new library. But that's the small things that really make a difference in your everyday that you can achieve with redistricting. The other thing is, in order to be a part of the process, you have to be able to understand the process and have access to the process. So, for example, in Virginia and in New Jersey, we advocated that these commissions both had commissions and they had websites. And by that, I mean independent commissions. So depending on your state, you can have the state legislature draw the maps, or some states have independent commissions or bipartisan commissions that do the maps. And then there's some involvement of the courts, and Jerry will talk a lot about that. So I don't want to get into it, but just to not assume things here. That website was in English only. The hearings were only in English. The ability of time you got to testify was the same if you had a translator or not, which is clearly unfair. So these were the things that we helped our organizations on the ground that Christine talked about advocate and help their communities advocate for, so that they could, in fact, meaningfully participate in the redistricting process. And I think that's something as we go forward is going to keep coming up, and that we should be mindful of, because, even in places where people have the best of intentions, if you can't tell the map drawers what your communities of interest are because you can't communicate that, then it does us no good. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. So I joined AALDEF 11 years ago to work specifically on redistricting, and we were very successful in the last round. I'll give you one example. In New York, we actually had to litigate. We went to federal court. A special master was hired to draw congressional lines. They took it away from the state legislature. They just didn't do it. And we asked the court to draw the lines. And we never had an Asian American representative in Congress from New York State, despite having over 1 million Asian Americans in New York City alone. It would have been like the 10th largest city after Dallas if you just had only the Asians in New York City. Yet we never had an Asian American representative from Congress. And you think, how is that possible? When you see how our communities were divided all over the state, especially in the city, that explains why. Because when you divide our community, when we should have been able to elect a candidate of our choice, if you kept us together and not divide us, well, that's what was happening. And the special master adopted almost a carbon copy of our proposal. And by the way, it was a joint proposal. We worked with the Black and Latino community, and we put together what we called a unity map, where it was a joint proposal for state assembly, state senate, and congressional lines. The special master adopted it and kept this district in Queens. As some of you that are familiar with New York City, Flushing, which is really the hub, the main Chinatown of Queens, that was the center of the district. It was a plurality Asian district. And 5 months later, we had the first Asian American elected to Congress from New York State, after all these years of not having anybody, because we had a fair district. And whenever we talk about redistricting, I'd like to say, in my opinion, redistricting is the most effective voter suppression tool out there. It is the most effective because of all the other things that we were talking about, of SB1 and these criminalizations and voter registration barrier. You don't have to do any of that. Let them all vote. You can let everybody vote if you disenfranchise people through redistricting, because those communities, when they're divided, will never have the ability to have affect the outcome of an election. And one example from this cycle was this community called Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park. It was divided into 7 different state assembly districts. It's just horrible. And the New York Times actually covered it, which is a big victory for us. And this is more effective when you could see it on a map, so it's kind of hard to describe here. But when you outline the contours of your community, the boundaries, and that's one of the first things we ask people, what's the northern, southern, eastern, western boundaries to the street of your community? Once we have that established, we say, okay, we're going to superimpose the legislative lines. Well, put the state assembly lines over your community, the state senate lines, the congressional lines, the city council lines. That is usually when the light bulb goes off for their community groups. They're like, oh, that's why we can't elect anyone. We keep running candidates and we're not able to get over the hump, and that's why. And the reverse is true, though. When we do have victories, and we've had several, where you keep the community whole within one district, almost right away you have the community able to elect a candidate of their choice. So we've been able to advocate, as Christine mentioned, we started really early. You know, after the last redistricting cycle, I really never stopped talking about redistricting because I realized how important it was. And we started very early with census. We were talking about redistricting, said it's not over yet. It's going to go out the window, all this work that we did on census, if we don't have fair districts. Our community was so engaged, and in my opinion, maybe I'm biased from what I saw, with just the most prepared. We came in there at these hearings with our maps. This is our community of interest map. Here are the boundary lines, because all the map drawers, the entities that were in charge of redistricting, they'd always ask, well, do you have a map? Right? And we said, yes, we do. Here, the AALDEF drew this map, and we support this map. We had the testimonies ready. We told them how to testify about communities of interest, which was very compelling. The reason we had our community so ready for this, we always have an eye towards litigation. And this is establishing a great record in case we do have to litigate. And I'll just close with this. For example, in New York, there was mention of how crazy things were. There's complete Democratic control. They had an independent redistricting commission. They didn't follow the procedure that was required by that. It also required that you couldn't draw lines to favor one party over the other. It was challenged in some really rural, conservative county, 6 hours away from New York City. No surprise, the judge ruled in favor of the petitioners there, the Republicans. But then the surprise was the appellate division ruled in the Republicans' favor. And the big surprise, Court of Appeals, appointed by all 7 members are appointed by Democratic governors, ruled 4-3 in favor of the Republican challengers. So all of a sudden, they didn't send it back to the legislature. They sent it back to that one Republican judge. So you had this one Republican judge in a rural county drawing the entire state, Senate, and congressional lines for a deeply blue state. We drove the 6 hours with a few of our members there in a coalition that we had, and we were able to testify and have our maps submitted, to have our testimony submitted, and the lines just came out this past Friday from the special master, and they kept most of our communities whole. And they cited to the maps and our testimonies and our groups several times in the decision. And it sort of all just came together because we had our community prepared.
Yeah. I'm actually going to keep the spotlight on Jerry because I think in many ways the headlines about what's happening in New York are a little bit different, right? Like we're talking about democratic chaos. You've got longtime incumbents who may have to run against each other. The party is up in arms about sort of the way this special master drew the map. And I will say, if this doesn't convince us that redistricting matters and the fact that there are archaic laws on the book and mechanisms that create just weird outcomes, which means we have to fight even harder to make sure we're prepared. I mean, there's no better example. I mean, what is a special master, right? Like a special master is drawing district lines. That's communities should be drawing district lines, right? But Jerry, I think, one thing that I kind of picked up from you is that the outcome in New York, as far as our community is concerned, is still fairly positive, despite the fact that, again, the national headlines from a progressive perspective is generally just been chaos. So how do you sort of parse through all of that?
It's fairly simple for me. Our focus is racial justice. So I did not once, when we were drawing maps, look at political data. And it makes it very easy for me to do this work and to tell communities this truly is nonpartisan. We're not drawing for any party or any candidate. We are drawing for our community. And yeah, politically, I see it. I mean, and it very well may be the reason for the change in the House. And that was definitely something that was on other people's radar. But, we were focused solely on that issue is do communities of color that are protected under the Federal Voting Rights Act. It's the Black community, Latino, Asian, and Native American. And New York City is not a big Native American population. So it's really the Black, Latino, and Asian communities. are these groups, do they have an equal opportunity to elect candidates of their choice? That's the frame that we were analyzing this. And our partners in the Unity Map, this year, this cycle, we usually are supposed to get the census data, redistricting data in April. We got it in the middle of August, and hearings were already underway. It was such a miracle that we were working around the clock. It's hard enough to draw your own whole plan, but we were working with the Black and Latino community. It was 10 times harder to have these really tough compromises. But it's the third cycle now where we came up with this unity map, and it had so much power behind it, because when you have not only your community, but other communities all supporting one map, the media picked up on it, the legislators picked up on it, and they had to deal with our map. And our goal was to have that be the benchmark. And yeah, we had, media's reaching out to us. We knew that in this lawsuit that both sides would try and use our community. And I want to be clear about that. Both parties are happy to use our community when it's expedient for them. And we're well aware of that. So it was pretty straightforward for us to just look at it through the racial justice lens.
And I think it's also important to really reemphasize the coalitions that were built. And it wasn't only for redistricting, but a lot of these relationships were built year after year, because all of them have been working together on increasing voter registration and getting out the vote too. And so because of those relationships, I think there's more trust, and then there's more of an ability for us to really talk it through to be able to get the maps that we ultimately wanted that was helpful for everyone.
And I did want to say, we had an Asian coalition. I mean, even just as my work with the AALDEF, the Asian American, I tell it's a very pan-Asian. When we say Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian. We also include Arab Americans. We had the Unity Map Coalition, then I had a separate Asian coalition called APIAVote in New York. And I had to really make sure everybody stayed in line with the messaging of Asian. I didn't want people to focus too much on their own ethnic identity, because when you look, we parse this out by ethnic identity, and especially for redistricting, the numbers get very small. And it's very important. And I think it was powerful to have East Asians advocating for Indo-Caribbeans and vice versa, and the different ethnic groups all saying we're Asian Americans and we're advocating for each other's communities throughout the city. And that was, I think, very effective.
I like this positive energy we've shifted to. We spent a good part of the morning talking about all the things that are going wrong with the state of voting rights.
Well, I didn't talk about Texas redistricting.
That's right. Having worked for a member from Texas, Congressman Al Green, who's great, by the way, Texas is always on my mind. In some ways, I'm grateful that I have a little bit of distance these days, because it's pretty wild down there. But I'll say, let's stay in this positive energy, because I think, we are the fastest growing demographic group in the country. We all know the talking points. But Christine, what does this mean for us in terms of your vision for the future, your eyes on the horizon? I think we've shown every election cycle over the last few, we're growing. I feel like there's a training montage that our community's going through, and we're getting stronger. We're putting more in our back pocket, and we're getting ready for the next one. So what does this year and maybe the future look like?
Well, this is my homework assignment for all of you. I'm asking all of you to go back home to your own family and friends to start that conversation. You can even utilize that you were just in Washington, D.C., you went to this great conference and gala, and you got really energized, but have those discussions to open up the door with your family and friends about the elections that are coming up. But it goes back to just having a conversation with them about what are the issues that are weighing on their minds right now, and helping them connect the dots between the issues to the importance for them to register, and then ultimately to cast their ballot if they can, right? And also with those kind of conversations, we encourage you to also work with your employee resource groups or other institutions and nonprofits, whatever association or whatever your tribe may be. We're asking you to also participate as an organization with our civic holidays. Starting in September, the nation will celebrate National Voter Registration Day. Then we go into National Voter Education Week to Vote Early Day. And those are 3 specific holidays where it really helps every individual to be able to think through what they need to prepare to actually be able to cast their vote. But we need more API involvement and organizations and your leadership to make sure that all of our communities that are growing and taking an interest participate in those holidays. Because like I said, we just outlined, there's so many things that have changed. So we really need to start the conversation now. We cannot afford to wait until 4 weeks right before the elections. Because it actually sticks in one's mind when we actually make this as part of our everyday conversation and a part of our daily lives.
So I think as we are growing in political power, hopefully it will mean that people come to us for our votes and ask us what we need. But I also worry, sorry, not to stay positive, about how our communities are going to be pitted against other communities of color. It's something that Jerry touched on a little bit, and I want to just talk about that because I think culture wars are coming, or they're here, and we're going to become a leading player in it as a community. And any individual that tries to say that this community is bad or this community is good, I would encourage to have that conversation internally and not engage in that. Because it's those people that come after our communities at the end of the day. We have examples like the China Initiative, for example. Who did that and why and who stopped it? Again, by joining forces. It's really important. We have Asian hate coming at us from every nook and cranny, and who is doing anything to stop about it? And so when we come into our own as a community and we have increased political power, we are also, it's incumbent upon us to not be used to foster further division. And so I would say, and voting is a really big way to do that. And remember, it's not just federal elections, it's local elections that are even more important, school board elections, state elections. These are where the policies are going. These are where the lines that Jerry talked about were coming into play. And it was important that we have our voices in those as much.
Yeah. Anybody here from Fort Bend County, Texas? Some of you may know that. Sugar Land, big Asian American enclave. And I will get positive in a second, but I do have to lay out, when you look at the growth in a place like Texas, the only state that actually gained 2 congressional seats in reapportionment, 95% of that growth, 4 million people, were people of color. And those new lines don't reflect that. The majority white districts actually increased. And in a place like Sugar Land in Fort Bend, Texas, where if you did a heat map of the Asian population in Texas, you see the highest concentration in those areas in Sugar Land and Fort Bend County. And you see how the state Senate lines are drawn, 3 lines right through the heart of that thickest concentration, and taking a piece of that concentration of that community and grouping it with white rural communities hundreds of miles away. That's what they were doing. That's what they've done in Texas. And that's why we're challenging those lines. And as I said before, when you do things like that, you don't need voter suppression on any other area. Let them all vote. They're not going to be able to have an outcome on the election. So that's why redistricting is so important. That's why we're fighting so hard for it. But when we do win, the way I look at it is we're trying to set the table for the community. I don't care who runs. I don't care which party. Again, I want somebody from the community to run and to win. And we're only able to do that if we have fair districts. So I'm going to encourage those of you, it's sort of a chicken or the egg sometimes. Why aren't people running? Why aren't people voting? Well, if you have a fair district, that usually it's going to happen. Somebody's going to run and more people are going to turn out to vote. So I'm going to encourage people, please, if you're thinking about it, run for office. We need more people from our community running for office. We need more people as poll workers to be there when our community shows up to vote. I'm going to shamelessly make a plug to volunteer with AALDEF for our Asian American exit poll and poll monitoring program. We're going to be doing that again this fall in 14 states in Washington, D.C. It is 3 hours on election day minimum. We will do a training for those of you that are CLE, that are attorneys. We have CLEs, 1.5 credits, half a credit of ethics, which is always hard to pick up. But it's only 3 hours on election day. And it's one of the best things you can do. When I was in Big Law before I was at AALDEF, and I volunteered for the first time in 2008 with AALDEF's Asian American exit poll. And I was in Eastern Queens, not too far from where I live in Nassau County. I actually personally knew a lot of the aunties and uncles that were voting at this poll site. And probably like most of you, I never had a problem voting. I'd be in and out in 5 minutes, no problem. When I was at this poll site, it's the first time I started seeing people, as soon as they opened their mouths and the accent was able to be heard, it was like, wait, what? And then all of a sudden, the poll workers were more aggressive. So many of them were turned away, and it really made an impact on me. And I decided to volunteer more with AALDEF, and I eventually became staff. But I would encourage all of you to do something. Be a poll worker, volunteer with AALDEF or any other organization. Make a plan. Take the day off, please. Take the day off on election day, because our community needs you. And we do have increasing political power, but we can't realize that if people are staying home and not voting.
And I'll do the plug for the APIAVote hotline that's jointly organized by Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC, and APIAVote. You can actually call the hotline year round, but we go live typically at the beginning of October. And so we need volunteers throughout the month, and you could do this virtually. We're looking, especially for those who have language capabilities, because we host the hotline in 7 different languages. What we also found in 2020, when APIAVote and our partners sent out a mailer, translated mail into 700,000 households, we got thousands of calls as soon as it landed. That only showed that there is a need out there. And honestly, it's so much nicer to accept calls for people that are actually asking for help versus many times you're so frustrated when you're doing phone banking and everyone's hanging up on you. So it's just a wonderful feeling to be able to accept those calls and really help those individuals, especially in language.
So we are coming up on time, and as I'm listening to our speakers, I'm thinking back to a panel that I was on earlier this month. I was actually with Christine talking to a number of Asian American realtors, right? And I told them, there's a language that they speak, commissions, fair housing stuff, things that when they hear it, they perk up. And what I said to them is, look, when you're engaging with elected officials, doesn't matter if they're Republicans or Democrats, the language they speak is elections, voting, and constituents. And I think this is something we all recognize, but oftentimes we should remind ourselves and really use it to center ourselves in the work. This is how we get people's attention, whether it's voting, redistricting, other civic engagement activities. It has to matter to us, and it has to matter to every single person in this room, no matter kind of what walk of life you're coming from. I think many of you are coming from, big companies that are supporting APEX, which we're, very grateful for. But I think the challenge for all of us is, how do we take this back, within our own work, the challenges that we have to navigate in our own work. How do we show up for the community? I think you all are uniquely positioned to support the work that's been talked about. And so I really would challenge all of you to take that on, right? It matters more now than ever. We've seen what happens when we are, either our power is diluted through a map, or our community just simply doesn't show up to vote because their access to the ballot box has been restricted. It has to matter. And we might as well start this work today. So I will say thank you all for joining us. Thank you for our speakers for sharing all their wisdom, their brilliance. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And hopefully it won't be another year until I see you all again. So thank you all very much.
Questions?
I think we have a few minutes left. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, it comes in a variety of different ways depending on how big it is, right? If it's something that's statewide, we could be covered in the media, or we are apprised sometimes through our exit poll and poll monitoring. An issue comes up. That's probably the number one way we usually are apprised of things. Back before Shelby County v. Holder, we had pre-clearance, and there was, one aspect of that was notice. So the DOJ would have a website, and then all of our groups, we could look at that website. Oh, Alabama is doing this new thing, or they're seeking pre-clearance for this. We're completely in the dark now. We don't have that anymore. So we're relying even more on our community-based organizations and partners. The smaller stuff, unfortunately, a lot of that just goes unchallenged because we don't know about it.
But it also goes back to our regional trainings that we do, because we have to train our volunteers first to be able to look out for these things. And many times because they're already implementing a Get Out the Vote plan. They're helping individuals getting to the polls, providing rides, providing language assistance. So they're also there to provide the feedback. So many of our local partners are working with all three of us on election day, as well as weeks leading up to it. So that's how we hear about it, as well as all the hotlines when they make the calls and report that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge. My question is about redistricting. Recently, I'm from California, and I'm Samoan, and I do a lot of work around climate change and sea level rise. But the last redistricting opportunity, I got involved for the first time. For the first time, I had no clue what it was. And we were brought together by, also we had a legal team who wanted to work with us to change some district lines. And this is in San Mateo County. We did come together just by listening to your story and how you guys went ahead and were successful. We had a community map. We actually spent a lot of time drawing up a community map with community support. And a lot of it, when I think about it, even with my own input, a lot of it were the similarities creating that community of interest. And for us in San Mateo County, one of the most vulnerable county to sea level rise, a lot of our focus was on climate change and environmental disparities and environmental justice. We weren't successful. We had a community map. We went against two other maps. One map created by one person, one guy, and then there was an old map. So in the end, the people who made the decisions didn't even compromise or even consider a community map that came with all this community input and community priorities. I guess my question is, how can we improve on that effort? I think just by listening to you guys today, I didn't realize how important those lines are. I think going in, I wasn't aware and even more educated about the issue. But what we could have done different. And also, listening to you about litigation, how would you know that, because I think I would go with something like that if they didn't accept a line or a map from the community. Even though that one thing I did learn is that community of interest was a very important factor in considering this line. So just asking for an advice, like how would we do that different?
So I would say under the Voting Rights Act, there are certain requirements. If met, you can actually force or require a jurisdiction to draw a district that keeps your community whole. But you have to usually be the majority of a district, right? So 50.1% of a district. And now many times our community is not able to meet that threshold, especially if it's a larger district like congressional or state senate or something like that. So we have to fall back on communities of interest. And unfortunately, in many states, that basically means please, right? You're not required to do it, but you should do it. And many times the map drawers, they're self-interested. They're not going to do it. So how do you get them to do something that they don't want to do that might be against their self-interest? When you have the other coalitions, the more people you can bring in to your coalition and say the same message over and over, get the media involved, talk to local reporters, you put that public pressure, have rallies before a hearing. And if you have a coalition, don't have one coalition leader say, I speak for the coalition, here's our message, and that's it. Have every single member of that coalition speak and say the same message so they're getting hit speaker after speaker after speaker after speaker, so it gets covered, and then you get pressure on them. Ultimately, if you don't have a legal hook, you're gonna have to resort to that outside pressure. And if you are lucky enough and have somebody that has relationships with the elected leaders, then you have like an inside strategy. We have people talking in closed doors, back rooms, saying, what can you do for us? Ideally, you have both of those things going on. Backroom deals or backroom access and the public pressure, media pressure.
everything Jerry said, but I just want to add again, I think it sounded like from what you were saying, you were organizing your community of interest around environmental justice issues. And unfortunately, in the Voting Rights Act, that's not a protected class, as we would call it, right? Like Jerry talked about earlier, you need to be Asian, Latino, Black, or Native American. And so to Jerry's point, if you build your coalition larger and there's a legal hook under the Voting Rights Act, then it can be challenged. But also, work with your local coalitions to see, because California is a really great Voting Rights Act of its own, and what's protected under California law could be more expansive than what's protected under the Federal Voting Rights Act. This is also just another plug for passing federal voting legislation, because as we pointed out, communities that are not included in the Voting Rights Acts, including the Arab American community, North African communities, these are all also equally important communities of interest that are not covered by the Voting Rights Act, which means that if you speak Arabic or you speak Persian, that is not always a language that's going to get covered. It's going to be a uphill fight. So again, just a plug for federal reform also.
So we are at time. I would recommend that if you have other questions, you should track one of them down, corner them before they're able to leave, because, again, they have plenty of information. They've always been a resource to me and the members of NCAPA. It's been a pleasure. And I will say in closing, we talked about if we aren't willing to take on the responsibility of doing this work, we can't be mad at the outcomes, right? And when it comes to our communities, the Asian American, Pacific Islander community, you're all here because you care, right? So if not us, then who? So that's the question I leave with all of you. Thank you. Oh, follow everybody on social media. We'll make sure the handles get out. I have to run. I have another event. So again, it's been a pleasure with all of you, and thank you very much.